Hello and welcome. My name is Noam Unger, and I'm the Director of the Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative here at CSIS. Thank you for joining today's discussion about the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, which is also known as PREPARE. PREPARE is an initiative that President Biden launched in his first year of office as part of efforts to restore U.S. leadership on the world stage with regard to climate change, which included rejoining the Paris Agreement on day one of his presidency. So it was 2 years ago this month at COP26 in Glasgow that the White House unveiled PREPARE as a whole of government initiative intended to serve as the cornerstone of the U.S. efforts to address the increasing impacts of climate change. The stated ambition of this presidential initiative is to advance a more coordinated approach to help more than 500 million people in developing countries, those most vulnerable worldwide, to adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change by 2030. Last fall, the administration released the PREPARE Action Plan, which helped to clearly communicate more of the specifics around this initiative, its 3 key pillars, and what the work would entail. And now, in the run-up to COP28, which begins in a couple of weeks in Dubai, the White House has just released Helping the World Prepare, a primer on U.S. international adaptation and resilience. This latest report shares examples of how federal agencies are building on past experience to implement PREPARE. For this discussion of how to rebuild or how to build resilience to the impacts of the climate crisis in developing countries, we're joined by 4 wonderful leaders. Swati Veeravalli serves as the Director for Climate Security and Adaptation at the White House National Security Council. Christina Chan, with the State Department, is the Senior Adaptation Advisor to the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. Ann Vaughn is USAID's Senior Advisor for Climate Change in the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. And to helpfully provide us with a private sector perspective, we have Michael Okoroafor, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at McCormick & Company. Before I turn to them, I want to mention to all of our live viewers and listeners today that if at any point you have a brief question for our panelists, please go ahead and enter it by clicking on the button that says Ask Questions, and that can be found on this event's webpage or in the YouTube description section. We'll do our best to work those into the discussion as it progresses. So Swati, I'd like to turn to you first, since you sit at the White House and this is a presidential initiative. Could you talk a bit about the imperative for this interagency or whole of government work on global climate adaptation and resilience?
Thanks, Noam. I would love to do that. First, I really want to thank CSIS for hosting us today, and to my fabulous panelists who will, I'm sure, have much more wonderful things to say. I'll just start by saying, and you've heard this before on multiple occasions, that the climate crisis is the existential challenge of our time. The warming planet endangers not only Americans, but people around the world, risking water and food supplies, public health, infrastructure, and our national security. Without immediate global action during this crucial decade, global temperatures will cross the critical warming threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, after which most scientists have warned, pun intended, some of the most catastrophic climate impacts will be irreversible. Because of this, President Biden has emphatically stated that we are at a significant inflection point in world history. El Nino, coupled with the deepening climate crisis, will irrevocably protract conflict, increase fragility, erode development gains, and illuminate persistent inequities. Even if all nations implemented their announced mitigation pledges, with emissions peaking in the mid-2020s, climate change will still impact many facets of human life in every sector of society far into the future. It is glaringly apparent that we must de-risk ourselves from the security implications of climate, and that the time to adapt is now. President Biden has made clear that climate considerations are an essential element of his administration's foreign policy as well as national security. He says, and I quote, "The United States will move quickly to build resilience both at home and abroad against the impacts of climate change that are already manifesting and will continue to intensify according to current trajectories." Ensuring global commitment to adaptation is paramount. In 2022, global climate changes, weather events, and natural disasters resulted in economic losses, totaling over $313 billion. In response to these disasters, the U.S. government committed to ensuring the delivery of essential life-saving humanitarian assistance. We are perhaps more importantly seeking to ensure global resilience. by ensuring that communities and nations are stable enough to adapt to these changes in a way that increases our future adaptive capacity and in a manner that preserves both equity and justice. Effective and inclusive investments in climate adaptation minimizes the impact of climate change and in some cases even prevents them. For every $1 invested in climate adaptation, it yields about $2 to $10 in economic benefits. These benefits help avoid losses in lives and livelihoods, lower financial costs, and create meaningful jobs, contribute to greater security and stability, as well as strengthen capacity to protect hard-won development gains that we referred to earlier from being eroded by storms, droughts, rising sea levels, and other climate impacts. Which brings us to the reason we are all here today, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. Some quick context. In November 2021, at COP26, President Biden announced the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, PREPARE. PREPARE unites the diplomatic and development and technical expertise of the United States with the goal of helping more than 500 million people in the developing countries to adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change by 2030. Co-led by the U.S. Department of State and U.S. Agency for International Development, who you will hear from later, PREPARE is America's contribution to the global effort to build resilience to the impacts of the climate crisis in developing countries, building on over a decade of U.S. government experience in climate adaptation programming and diplomacy. The White House Action Plan for PREPARE was released in September 2022. The action plan defines strategic objectives that support the three interrelated and mutually reinforcing pillars of PREPARE, which are the first, knowledge is power, early warning systems and climate information. Pillar two, plans and programs, mainstream and integrate adaptation, build relationships, execute with focused action on infrastructure, food security, and water and health. Finally, pillar three, which is about resources and mobilizing finance and private capital. PREPARE is helping to increase U.S. investments in adaptation, and we are already many manifold, higher than our highest historical funding for adaptation. PREPARE is helping to support developing countries to create plans to better protect their communities from the impacts of climate change, of which you heard the devastating impacts before. By supporting over 70 developing countries to improve their adaptation strategies and national adaptation plans and adaptation components of nationally determined contributions, PREPARE will create more resilience to climate change. Before I end, I want to emphasize the uniqueness of PREPARE. From its inception to the past 3 years of implementation, over 19 departments and agencies have worked on PREPARE to align their activities to the action plan. This coordination collaboration has manifested the development of a monitoring and evaluation approach that is uniquely inherent to the U.S. government. This monitoring and evaluation and learning approach of MEL is absolutely fundamental to tracking PREPARE's progress towards its ambitious targets and for comprehensively communicating to the American people, Congress, global stakeholders, and most importantly, our global stakeholders on the comprehensive outcomes of this work. Importantly, our U.S. interagency monitoring and evaluation and learning approach will also ensure that the U.S. government investments in adaptation are improving and that we're capturing lessons learned in a way that's institutionalizing it for posterity moving forward. Such a collaboration of these departments and agencies is such an excellent testament to why we need a whole of government approach to tackling the climate crisis, particularly through adaptation. I'd like to conclude with a brief comment by Secretary Kerry, who recently stated, and I think that this sense of urgency that he imparts in his quote perfectly exemplifies the importance of PREPARE. We need to scale up investment in the most vulnerable places, at home and abroad, because the more we allow communities to be struck by repeated disasters without investing in adaptation, the more we risk the stability in whole parts of our world. Thanks for your time, and I'm super excited to hear from our fabulous colleagues next and look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Bill.
So much, Swati, and thanks for expanding a bit on what makes PREPARE unique and on the sort of simultaneous interagency effort around monitoring, evaluation, and learning as well. Christina, I'd like to turn to you next. Could you speak further about why the focus on adaptation and resilience is important, and especially why now? Like, how is this timely, and how are these issues rising within international diplomatic dialogues that you and Secretary Kerry and others are involved in?
Absolutely, Noam, and thank you also from my side to CSIS for organizing this event and giving us the opportunity to talk about prepare. In terms of why adaptation, why now? I've been working on adaptation probably for the last 20 years. So I would say we should have been doing more and better 20 years ago. But a lot of what Swati laid out in her initial remarks really does lay out the why now. The science is pretty clear that even if we succeed on the mitigation side and keeping global temperature increase as close to 1.5 as possible, there are certain changes that have already been put in place. And the science is there, but I'd also say, my kids see it, right? I'm sure you see it, your kids see it, the changes in terms of temperature rise, in terms of how much hotter it is in the summer here, those of us here in DC. I had the privilege, and I think Chloe from Save the Children is on. When I looked at the attendees, I had the privilege of meeting a couple of girl advocates through Save the Children last week, immediately coming out of a loss and damage meeting. And it was just so helpful to be reminded by these young girls who are here in the United States from Nigeria and Burkina Faso. The 15-year-old from Nigeria talked about floods that happened in her community in August of 2016 that killed her best friend and also her 6-month-old baby sister. So really the why adaptation and why now is absolutely clear from a human people perspective. We need to be doing more and we need to be doing better. That those stories from people like those child advocates who met with me last week through Save the Children sort of echo also what science is telling us, which is that the adaptation that we are currently doing is not enough. It is incremental and it is piecemeal. So one of the reasons why we as a global community and why we as the United States need to be more ambitious, more targeted, but also more coherent is because the adaptation we are doing today is not just not enough, but also too incremental and too piecemeal. From a diplomatic perspective, there is a lot of international. Our developing country partners in the global space continue to look to the United States for leadership when it comes to providing support on adaptation and resilience. And that's clear from the Glasgow outcome. So 2-3 years ago now, calling for and urging for a doubling of adaptation finance from bilateral donors. And this was coming on the backs of our own president's commitment to work with Congress to increase our own U.S. international adaptation budget 6-fold from the highest levels during the Obama era. One of the things that we felt as an interagency that was needed in addition to complement these financial commitments was leveraging our interagency expertise and our various comparative advantages to all be pointing towards the same North Star. And that North Star is laid out in Prepare. That even as we strive for increasing our budget 6-fold, it's really important, even with that increased budget, to be as effective and efficient as possible. The three areas that have consistently come up in the international space that we consistently hear from our partners, be they communities, be they community groups, or be they at the national level from our partners in the UNFCCC process. The 3 areas that consistently come up as priorities are: one is more support for climate information services and early warning systems. Swati was talking about the economic value. I believe there are statistics out there that even with just 24 hours advance warning, an early warning can reduce losses and damages by 30%. the benefit cost ratio of early warning systems is like more than 10 to 1. So $1 in early warning can lead to avoided losses, more than $10 in avoided losses. The Secretary General had put out a call for early warning for all. I believe it was last year, that we are now stepping up to respond to that call to action. So that's pillar 1 of prepare. Pillar 2 is on making sure that we integrate adaptation into key sectors that impact people's well-being. That's health, water, food security, and infrastructure. And Anne will talk more, I believe, about how we're doing that and examples. And then finally, the third pillar is on adaptation finance. And a key aspect of that is not just our contributions to multilateral funds like the Adaptation Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the GCF, but it's also our role as the public sector in mobilizing private sector engagement. So it's great to see Michael, you on this panel as well, and the great work that McCormick is doing. But really, the private sector, it's been incredible over the last 2 or 3 years to see what I think is a growing sea change in the way that businesses are thinking about adaptation, both in terms of the economic value of protecting their own assets and supply chains, but also the economic opportunity there is in investing in adaptation. So those are the 3 areas. Those are the 3 areas that Prepare is focused on. Those are the 3 areas where we're seeing demand from our developing country partners internationally. And a final word on sort of why we need to be doing more and better on adaptation now is actually the loss and damage conversation. So I've been deeply engaged over the last year on this transitional committee that was set up in Sharm to develop recommendations to operationalize this new fund. And I would say in every single conversation I've had with partners from developing countries, it is both we need to set up this fund, but also we need to be investing more in adaptation, because no one wants to be dealing with more loss and damage. Everyone wants to be minimizing losses and damages, which makes adaptation and resilience just so critical. So even as we are talking about loss and damage, the very clear message I hear from our global partners in that space is we need to be doing more to support adaptation and resilience in the most vulnerable countries. So, turn it back to you.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, I think that if it weren't, you're right about it being sort of something that should have been the focus even long before. But when you think about just the litany of disasters related to climate change and resilience just recently and how that is sort of pressing for policymakers, and I'm talking about just the rapid onset, which is just a fraction of the actual impacts of climate change, but from Pakistan to the Horn of Africa, to Libya, to the Sahel, to fires in Hawaii, and to life in major US cities like Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting right now, being horribly affected by fires in Canada for days on end. I think it's more pressing on the minds of many policymakers than it ever has been before. And I'd like to turn to you. I think a lot of people sometimes have trouble understanding or envisioning what adaptation and resilience work really looks like in practice, how it is or isn't different from other types of just development work. The primer, the document that was just released by the White House, actually includes a number of great examples, but perhaps you could speak to some of the examples and the rather broad scope that these programs have in practice.
No, great. Noam, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Also, thanks to CSIS for hosting and for flagging the primer again. We have such a great group of interagency partners working on Prepare. We're not going to be able to list every single one of them, but and all the good work that's being done. But the primer does capture a lot of that great work. Actually, there's still more that we're missing. We have to keep it to a certain page limit. But we really recommend it to folks calling in to see some of the breadth of the different technical expertise across our government that are working to try to help 500 million people become more climate resilient, which is our big vision under Prepare. And I think we go back to these pillars that we keep talking about. So when we think about adaptation and answering your question, Noam, is you cannot adapt if you don't have the right information and knowledge coming from climate that is actionable, timely and actionable. So we do spend, and I might spend a bit of time just focusing on some examples from Pillar 1 and what we're doing in that space. The need for it, I know we've already talked about need a bit, but I just want to reiterate some of the startling statistics that 60% of the African continent does not have access to early warning system. So information about, is it safe to send your kid to school before a flood, as Christina was handling, 60% of the continent doesn't have that. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to expand and build off the base of a lot of good work that we've already done across the interagency and have been doing for years. So for example, FuseNet stands for the Famine Early Warning System Network. It's a long-standing interagency program that incorporates expertise from, I'm going to use a lot of acronyms, USAID, NOAA, USGS, NASA, and USDA. So we've got a lot of brilliance across a lot of different agencies that helps monitor and anticipate famines. That's what it's been doing for decades now. But under Prepare in the last few years, we've really ramped up, and FuseNet is expanding its work to incorporate the health threats that include extreme heat and other risks that are growing because of climate change. So right now we're piloting those heat risks in Somalia and Mozambique, and it will help decision makers and folks on the ground understand the broader risks that we're seeing from climate that it impacts both food insecurity and other humanitarian development outcomes. But we couldn't look at that development lens and the humanitarian lens without taking climate and those models and kind of placing them on top of each other. We're also, and Swathi was mentioning, we're looking at conflict and climate risks also, and incorporating into FuseNet greater data and how we can overlay conflict and climate and how they overlap. And we're piloting that in Haiti and Mozambique. And we're hoping all of this information can better help policymakers, program managers on the ground, people that are dealing with this every day to get better information so that they can be prepared and respond better to different climate impacts that are happening and with increasing intensity. That's on FuseNet. On the difference that you can do on a daily, like what makes good development, what not. In the information space, I actually just got this in my email today, an update from a team in our team in Burkina Faso who are working on a project that looks at Initiative for Farmers Resilience, and it's equipped 1,500 farmers in Burkina with a type of weather forecasting services that's highly localized, because it doesn't matter if across the, it's going to be hot across the North Africa. It doesn't help a farmer. You need localized and accurate forecast designed for farmers. So through this system, you're getting daily SMFs, not on a smartphone, because a lot of farmers don't even, you need sometimes the most basic types of phones to give updated, detailed weather, likelihood, timely, and intensity of weather conditions. So we have this great kind of feedback from a woman named Yerbanga Madeline, who's a president of a cooperative in Burkina, that explains, to quote her, the agricultural forecasts are very important for farmers, and now we can plan our work based on text messages we receive on our phone. For example, this morning, we received a message forecasting rain, so I delayed spreading compost in my field. It may not seem like a big deal, but it's a time saver and a livelihood saver for farmers who are under extreme stress from climate change, especially because weather is just becoming so volatile. So that's Pillar 1, information systems. That just as one kind of two concrete examples from there. In Pillar 2, we talk about plans and programs and how we're integrating climate adaptation into these policies and programs. And it's really important that if we don't plan for climate risks, we're at risk of washing away these development gains. So for example, if we're building a school in an area that will face a dramatically increased risk of flooding, it's not a good use of funds, it's not safe for kids. If we build a new hospital that's got great climate infrastructure and it's going to withstand the worst extreme weather, but the road leading up to that hospital is in a floodplain and we're not building for that, that's also not a good use of funds and not getting people health care in these extreme weather events. So as Christina noted, we're focusing on infrastructure, food security, water, and health sectors to mainstream adaptation and really push and be thoughtful about the risks that are coming down. And I want to give a very strong shout outs and special thanks to the co-leads we have across the interagency who help co-lead these different work streams. So for example, Millennium Challenge Corporation and aid on infrastructure, USAID state on water, USDA and aid on food. It's just been great collaboration across the different interagency to dig deep into like, what the heck do we do with all of this climate data? So I'll just quickly go to highlight, for example, in infrastructure, Millennium Challenge Corporation and the government of Indonesia have developed an over 600 million compact that includes investments that will establish climate resilient infrastructure to withstand many of the impacts of climate extremes, especially for transportation and logistics. So they just signed it earlier this year, and it supports communities in the face of intensifying drought, floods, landslides, fires, and sea level rise. And if you think about it, Indonesia is a country of over 17,000 islands. If we're not accounting for sea level rise, we're not doing justice to any sort of investments. I would love to give shout out to our NOAA, our National Science Foundation, and Interior and other U.S. government participants in the Global Change Research Program that have been working to really incorporate health and climate risks. And I want to give two more sort of quick examples, but then we'll turn it back to you, Noam, because I know we're running out of time. USTDA, U.S. Trade Development Agency, is not the largest U.S. government agency, but my goodness, they are doing a great amount of work and a dozen different activities in the past 2 years to build resilient energy and water systems. This includes work in the Caribbean to help with energy procurement assistance programs. Now, if you're not in the government, that may not sound exciting, but if you don't get procurement right, you are not going to be able to shape how government spends its money. So USTDA is working for technical assistance to help in El Salvador to make sure their national utility is increasing water use efficiency through energy efficiency measures. So it'll help El Salvador manage different variability in the water supply due to climate change. And under Prepare, we've got a ton of different work we're building off of existing good efforts like Feed the Future, including USDA's launched an international climate hub that is helping to bring forward and share research tools and collaborative efforts across the world to be able to help and provide access to better information, and it's easily available online. I might stop there because I think I'm running out of time, but there's too many good things to talk about across the interagency, which is flagged under the adaptation finance pillar. The DFC has been a great partner, mobilizing, I think it's over 300 or committing over 390 million in 2022 for projects that support Prepare. And then I know Michael will talk about Prepare private sector call to action, because we have incredibly important work that needs to be done by the private sector. And if I've missed an agency, please check out the Prepare primer, because there's really good stuff going on. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Anne. It's actually great to sort of share those details or examples. And especially, I think, in so doing, you were speaking to the interagency cooperation that Swati alluded to earlier as well, just in how you describe what's going on. It's very impressive. I do think so much of what you're describing relates to something else that Swati said, which was about risk and de-risking, right? And so much of running any business is actually about knowing and understanding and managing your risks. And Michael, I want to turn to you, because pillar 3 of Prepare is all about resources. And a significant part of that is about mobilizing private capital and working with companies and businesses. And this past year, the administration, as Anne was just alluding to, issued a call to action to the private sector, and your company responded. And your company, I have to say, by the way, because I do all of the cooking in my house, I don't think there's like a day that goes by that I don't end up like using a McCormick product to season something that I'm making. So, you know, my family thanks you for that. But your company responded to this call to action. So explain a little bit about the calculus for why and how you have done that.
Thank you, Noam. And I also want to appreciate the CSIS for convening this. And of course, my colleagues, Swati, Christina, and I tell you, you guys are gracious and wonderful in work you do. What I'm hoping to do is to complement that. And I have to say something up front. In some of the things we've done, USAID is in the middle of it. They have been a great partner. I want to shout out to them. And I know we will continue to be partners for a long time. But let me really address why McCormick got into this. First of all, you need to understand that about 8 years ago, we decided to really pivot away from CSR, corporate social responsibility, because you know what that is? When companies are doing well, they give money to something. When they're not doing well, they cut back. No, we embedded what we call leading with purpose in our business strategy. Every business unit is embedded in it, and that's what drives it. So all our growth plan is embedded in this higher order sustainability we call purpose-led performance. Let me define that for you. It's simply the idea of delivering top-tier financial performance while doing the right thing for our people, our communities, and the planet we all share. This is the strategy, the holistic strategy we're adopting. And when we talk about communities, it's communities where we live, communities where we work, and communities where we source. Why is a country like Madagascar or Vietnam or Indonesia a part of our community? It's very simple. We source from over 80 different countries around the globe. And those countries have one thing in common. They are all in the global south. And this thing we talk about climate damage, really, they're bearing the brunt of it, and they didn't cause it. So for us to have, the reason we jumped first, we were early partners to prepare, was very simple. It's really about creating an enduring supply chain. If you're sourcing from these areas that are exposed, and you want to insulate yourself from the variability that climate change, you have to be at the forefront of fighting for it. So prepare was a true natural fit for us. And so if you look at our strategy, we went ahead and said, what are we going to do for those communities? There are several things. One is to create what I call a sustainable practices that will really endure. We created for the first time in our industry called Grown for Good. What is it? It's about maintaining farm level certification, good practices, but plus 3 other things. Community resilience, notice that word, women empowerment, and ethical supply chain, meaning no child should be forced to go work on the farm when they should be in school. So all that plus farm level certification, that's what we call the basis for our Grown for Good. And that Grown for Good has really driven some of the things we're talking about. What does it entail? It entails 3 things. One of them is regenerative practices. If you grew up in the farming community like I grew up, let me be honest, I grew up in a farming community in eastern part of Nigeria, and I heard Christina alluding to that. I know what they are talking about because I grew up in one of those villages. But here's the point. When you have something like that, you need to make sure people practice real sustainable practices like regenerative agriculture. Let me give you a simple example. If you go to a place like Madagascar, everybody knows almost 80-something% of the world's natural vanilla, not the stuff that will kill you, the chemical stuff, natural vanilla comes from Madagascar. We source almost exclusively from there. Do you know that Madagascar, we, in our group, areas where we work in the Andapa region, Moa and Sectoral region, I just want to make sure, we're teaching them regenerative practices because vanilla is an orchid. You stick it to the ground, you don't need to do that slash and burn. That was typical when I was growing up in one of those farming communities. So they don't need to do slash and burn. All you need to do is stick it on the ground so you don't really disrupt the soil and cause erosion. And then what does an orchid need? It needs a tree, a host tree. And the point that you have an orchid, which is also another thing that will, I call it nature-based solution for decarbonizing the farming communities, not just the vanilla crop, but also the host tree. All of that will help you scavenge CO2. So it's really important as we go on this journey to recognize that's really the reason we joined there. And the other thing is this idea of increasing resilience in smallholder farmers was critical to what we were doing. And we made a point that by 2025, we will impact over 35,000 farmers, not just to talk numbers, but that we will impact on our 5 iconic, the major ones that we sell that constitute a lot of things, and they are black pepper, which we source from Vietnam, red pepper, which we source exclusively from India, oregano that we source from Turkey. Okay, listen to the areas. And then you've got things like Indonesia for cinnamon, right? And when you're looking at all of those, it's important that we do the right things to build a resilient supply chain. One thing I would like to point out to show you how these things are interconnected, the largest spice manufacturing plant in the world is in Hunt Valley, Maryland. It's about 5 minutes away from where I am at our global headquarters, Hunt Valley. If we don't have those ingredients coming from these countries in the global south, we don't have a business. And we're one of the largest employers in Maryland. And I would say employ a lot of people around the country as well. The reason I'm telling you this is that's why That's the business case for doing this. Enduring supply chain, that's where we were early adopters or partners for Prepare. Our work also includes this idea of empowering women. Let me give you a little bit of statistics. In most farming communities, similar to the one I grew up in, most of the farms are owned by men. But here's the problem. Most of the workers are women. You know that practice from when I grew up hasn't changed to today. But McCormick decided to do something about it proactively as part of our purpose-led performance. So we go into those communities, thanks to CARE. Michelle Nunn has been a great partner to us. We have them go into the communities, understanding what is holding these women back from owning their own farms instead of being workers. And can I tell you what? The first time we started this program, USAID partnered with us when we created a village savings and loan in Madagascar. McCormick paid the interest on the loan upfront, so that these farmers, the women and some men, took the loan, started their farming, but when they finished, they sell it to McCormick. But they were adhering to that. Remember, growing for good practices, the good farming practices, they sold it to us as a premium. And today they are thriving because they didn't have to pay back the interest. So I give shout out to USAID. When they see good things, they jump on it. The other thing I would tell you is that if you go to farming communities and these women, when they are doing well, there is a saying when I was growing up is, if you empower a woman, you empower a household and you advance a nation. That's what's happening in those communities that we operate in. And you talk about all this impact of climate change. In a country like Madagascar, you guys have heard about NOAA. In 2015, you can't find anything that has devastated a country like Cyclone NOAA did. We were there helping them rebuild. And now they're building concrete houses instead of building something on steel that the cyclone will wash away. And they are thriving in those communities. The other point I want to mention to you is that it's not enough for us to do this alone. So we convened a group, industry group, and created what we call Supplier Leadership on Climate Transition, okay? Because we recognize that some of our suppliers supply to other people. I mean, you can't encapsulate air, so you can't encapsulate climate. It's everybody, it's going to affect everybody. When we started this, there were 3 companies, McCormick, PepsiCo, and Mars. And we created this in 2021. Today, there are over 24 CPG companies partnering because we recognize that this is a pre-competitive space. Nobody owns climate, we all own it. So because this is a pre-competitive space, we have everybody coming, and we have 24 CPG companies, major ones globally, part of it. But here's the kicker. The suppliers that are now part of it, as their last training, is over 700 suppliers from around the globe. That to me is how you make an impact. That to me is how you advance, prepare. That to me is how you build resilience. And I would like to say that adaptation without resilience doesn't work. And that's why the president's plan, emergency plan, to link both of them is critical. And I am so grateful to live in a country and be a citizen of a country where you have government agencies working together. And now, eager and continue to work with the private sector. We are delighted to be part of that. And the last thing I will tell you is this. At the Hunger Week this year, the UN General Assembly, you remember that the UNGC, I sit on the board of UNGC USA, they called this concept of faster forward. What we're trying to drive is faster forward at scale. That's what companies do well. Faster forward at scale. And so I can only tell you that through collaboration, we can achieve much. And I like to end and let's take any questions by referring you to my favorite African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. That's why we're in this together. That's how we're going to solve this. Finally, McCormick made a pledge as part of our purpose-led performance that we will really align with the Paris Agreement, not only for the near term, which is 2030, alignment with 1.5 degree pre-industrial global temperature, right? We said we're going to do that by 2030. Today, our plan and strategy has been validated by SBTI. As we speak, our net zero by 2050, consistent with our federal government, is being validated by SBTI. Hopefully we'll have something to share when we get to COP28 on that. So that is why That's the business case, and that is the reason McCormick is jumping all over this and will be part of the prepare as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And you know, you've piqued, I think, the interest of some of our viewers. There's already a question in the Q&A that I'll relay, and it's just a reminder to the more than 150 people who are listening in live to, if you have a question, to please ask it in the Q&A. Please include your affiliation and your brief question. The question is has to do with scale, and you brought this up towards the end of your discussion, Michael, about, you know, faster forward and at scale, and, you know, scaling things even for any company of different sizes takes a set of incentives. It takes investment. What are some of the things that maybe stand in the way of companies scaling up efforts similar to how McCormick has done it? Or what are some other things that could further enable the path that you're on?
Absolutely. Let me give you a simple one. And this is one that we've seen over the years. It's NIH, not invented here syndrome. The climate is one where you don't need NIH. We are in this together. I just gave you an African proverb. If you can't work with other people, it's a pre-competitive space. This is a case where we are all in it together, and we have to leverage ourselves into prosperity together. This is not a case where I want to invent my way into prosperity. It's about leverage collectively, collective leverage. That's the simple thing that is holding us back, is people want to say, I'm doing this. It doesn't matter. You're just a little drop in the ocean. But if we come together and become the ocean, we solve this thing, and that's what it is. And the last thing I would like to also mention is, if you look at investments, I don't know a single company or even a single government that can make enough investment that we need to make this transition to a safer world for our children and grandchildren and generations to come. I think in terms of it, in business terms, McCormick is a 134-year-old company. If you want this company to be another 134-year-old old in the future and more, we got to future-proof it. And that future-proof requires collective action. And if people realize that they have no supply chain, if we don't address climate change, they will turn to it. That's why I say we don't need that stumbling block of NIH, not invented here syndrome.
Thanks. There's another question that I'll direct back to our USG speakers, and maybe Anne in particular, but it comes from Jen Cease from Apt Associates, and it's about efforts to strengthen adaptation measurement through Prepare, right? And the question alludes to prior efforts, and I was at USAID during some of this time, of investments to really try to improve measurements of resilience, which is still not standard. And how are you wrestling with that going forward with regard to adaptation programming?
No, great question from Jen, who knows this space well. But and I think, I mean, Noam, also to your point, I mean, we've got in my bureau we have the Center for Resilience that's got 10 plus years of working on resilience metrics and trying to figure this out. And it's not, just to be honest, it's not cake. It's not easy. But I think we've got some really good minds, and I have an interagency working group that in a community of practice that we've been building to try to address some of these efforts, because we feel like if we can't measure it, it's really hard. I really appreciated Swachi's which she started out with talking about monitoring and evaluation. If we can't measure this, it's hard to show the impact that we're having and continue to build support for this. If you look at PEPFAR, if you look at Feed the Future, the strength of a lot of those programs and why they've lasted for decades plus now is because we've been able to get to this, the measurement side of things. So we've got, again, a community of practice that's digging into how do we expand and get and do better on the metrics across the board. But there's also something interesting when you look at adaptation. It's you can measure and count the number of people that now have climate information services. The example from the head of the cooperative that I referenced at the beginning was, yep, they now have that information. Some of our agencies are doing great work, but are not working in that space. And if we're looking at financial transactions and money leverage, that's a different metric too. So we have to be holistic and want to be able to capture all of the good work that we're doing across 19 departments and agencies, as well as account for different different sort of baselines from where folks are starting and the type of programming that they're doing. So it is a work in progress, but one I think that we're racing for and have some really smart minds on. But welcome actually how other peoples are looking at this too, so we can make sure we're learning from the best and brightest. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. Christina and Swati, just signal if you want to jump in on either of those points, but I have further questions for folks as well. One of the questions that I have has to do with, we're headed into COP28, right? And so how does prepare and this progress that you're describing quite well in this conversation, how does that position the U.S. government heading into COP28? And how is prepare related to the issues that we should all be expecting to see arise or emerge from Dubai? I don't know, Christina, maybe turn to you first.
I'm happy to take that, but I also just wanted to add to the previous question, the importance of monitoring and evaluation, and not just at State and Aid, but we've got 19 agencies, and that's no small feat given that each agency has a different reporting system, a different M&E system. But I also wanted to emphasize just how critical learning is. So it's not just about the monitoring and evaluation, but learning, speeding the further faster and not alone when it comes to learning across the 19 agencies. And that's learning about what works, but also what doesn't and why in a safe place, right? Which is kind of a cheesy thing to say, but I think it's really important that our community practice has been built to create that space to talk about what works and what doesn't. To your question about COP28, one of the 3 mandated outcomes from Dubai is the global goal on adaptation. And so for those who are not familiar, the Paris Agreement had an article on adaptation, and that article, Article 7, established a global goal for adaptation. It's known, or it's spoken about as the GGA. And the GGA aims, what the GGA is a global goal that is about enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. It's a global goal, it's a collective goal. One of the major outcomes, the mandated outcomes from Dubai, is going to be a decision on adaptation that includes a framework to guide the implementation of the GGA. So over the course of these past 2 years, we've been working to develop this framework that highlights the importance of all countries taking on and doing more, further, faster, as Michael said, on adaptation, and also improving our ability to track progress on adaptation over time. I was saying in my opening remarks that the U.S. design prepare based on the priorities that we understand from countries, developing countries themselves, through their national adaptation plans, through their nationally determined contributions, and what they've communicated through those reporting and communication vehicles. Those priority areas, climate information services, integration into key sectors that influence human well-being, and also the mainstreaming of adaptation. Those are key elements for prepare, and no surprise, those are sort of priority areas that we see are critical for the framework for the global goal on adaptation. And we truly believe that it's important for the framework to emphasize the importance of all of these pieces and the monitoring, evaluation, and learning aspects as well. And so we're really hopeful to come out of Dubai with a solid framework with additional work sort of post-Dubai. Our contribution to the framework, because of I think what will very likely be an alignment between what we've identified through prepare and what we anticipate coming out of this framework. Hopefully our contributions are both in terms of our support to vulnerable countries, but also what we can add in terms of what we are learning, both in terms of what works and what doesn't, to the global conversation.
Great, thanks. Swati, I want to bring you in, and I want to connect it a little bit to this question of what's needed for Prepare to Succeed. And there was already quite a bit of discussion from you at the start, from Anne just now, around the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which is critical to the success of the effort. But another piece really is about Pillar 3 and the resources, right, associated with this work. The vision at the launch of Prepare was to work with Congress to provide $3 billion in adaptation finance annually by fiscal year 2024. And that's the fiscal year that we're in now. And the budget that the president put forward did align with that commitment, but that's just a request that goes to Congress. You, in your comments at the start, were talking about how Prepare is really a prevention effort, and that these early warning systems and other elements of prevention really are saving money, right? So how does the White House actually continue to make this case at this time that's critical to ensure that the resources are there and that these investments upstream in prevention are actually enabling the US and our partners around the world to actually save money?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. I think that's sort of a call to action, I think, and pun intended, I'm full of puns today, for us to get the messaging better on why investing in adaptation now has a return on investment that is not only now, but medium and long term into the future. And I mean, I think in terms of what is needed for Prepare to Succeed is, through the work of Christina and Anne, at COP and our interagency stakeholders and partners is ensuring that adaptation gets as much oxygen as the mitigation conversation. Because if we don't do that, then it doesn't matter how much mitigation is going to occur if we're not able to instantiate behavior change. And so from a White House perspective, I think that's why we're sort of pivoting to resilience and the opportunity that climate change offers us to get that resilience right in a way that we haven't been able to address before. I came from the Department of Defense before, and I think what really struck me was that how climate change offers an opportunity for unconventional stakeholders to get together to talk about how they're dealing with the crisis. I mean, we just heard a fantastic overview from Michael and McCormick on how the private sector is doing that as well, and how they're in all of these investments. We want to ensure that people are adapting a climate lens to it. So that the behavior change is incremental, but in a way that is also sort of globally moving the ball forward on ensuring that we're getting to adaptation. Because if we don't have people think about how they are responsible personally, as well as entities are responsible personally, and corporations are responsible personally for climate change, then we can't sort of succeed in our mission to tackle the climate crisis. So talking about the resilience as a lens, for climate and tackling the climate crisis is really how the White House is positioning this. So Michael alluded to clean resilient supply chains. And I think it's such a fantastic way of looking at the climate question. I think COVID offered us a great lesson that we are learning from, that if we don't do the supply chain resiliency and we don't ensure macroeconomic impacts are minimized because of the climate or other shocks to the system, then what are we doing this for at the end of the day? And so I think that it's very top of mind now, but I urge all of the folks listening in to sort of think about themselves and how we can help sort of communicate the importance of adaptation, which is why I really appreciate the convening here today.
Thank you. I mean, it really is quite interconnected, and that's why I'm so glad that we have leaders from the U.S. government on this call, but also Michael. And Michael, you're like singularly representing the entire private sector, but you alluded to the 24 partners and the 700 suppliers, and maybe we'll have to have a whole other session just to hear from the private sector, because those numbers could and should easily double in some ways in terms of those that are really working deeply in this space. There's a question from one of our webinar participants, Ari Davidov, who is, the question's about scaling, the scaling of the 3 pillars of prepare, and can it be thought of holistically? And for example, can climate information and early warning system development, it depends on added climate finance and produces cross-sectoral impacts. And I think, it relates to a conversation that we were having even just here at CSIS in a morning discussion with representatives of the FAO and USAID on food security, about how sometimes platforms that are intended for climate information, like some of the platforms, Anne, you were describing, where SMS texting to smallholder farmers about climate information can actually be thought of as a platform, and other services can start to be layered in. And when you think about layering of services connected to insurance, you're getting into other aspects of business and commercial engagement that is actually advancing this agenda. So Anne, Michael, don't know if you have thoughts on this front, but I want to bring you back in.
I would love, and Christina and Swati had to live through the writing of the action plan that's on the White House that was published last year. We trying to divide up adaptation was quite hard, but you kind of hit the nail on one of the struggles that we had of CIS and climate information service. It's so important across all sectors and how to incorporate that. So we definitely, in terms of, we cannot scale, we can't at all, and on the government side, on the donor side, if we don't look at this thing holistically. So it's an easy cop-out answer, but basically, yeah, we are trying to do that. And layering, the resilience terminology of layering and sequencing on top of each other is just really important when we have these different climate impacts. I turn to Swati or Michael, both of you come off mute if you have other things to add, but a hearty yes, we have tried to incorporate that into our work. Over.
So if I can build on that, I think Anne captured it very effectively. But the thing I would tell you is the thing that attracted us to be early callous signatories to the prepare action was the fact that the 3 pillars, in our opinion, need to align with each other. They actually reinforce each other. In fact, one of the things I'm hoping to share at COP28 is the progress we've made, especially in the farming communities with women farmers, and the people that were taught. We said we're going to build resilience in those farming communities. That's why I love the comment that Christina made, and Swati, you also. This idea of having adaptation as critical, not just mitigating this. It's like handout. Let's talk about adaptation and the fact that adaptation with resilience is what's going to get us to the promised land. So I would like to share those numbers. That's one. The second thing that I would like to say is even some of the things we're doing in the global north, where most of our employees reside. We're doing things that are unique that also play to those 3 pillars, like net zero factories. We just built one in Peterborough, UK, net zero in construction. We're now working to make it net zero in operation. Or in Baltimore, I don't know if you guys knew this, and we'll be visiting it hopefully in January with Dina and the team. We just put a net, what I call carbon neutral factory. It's in Sparrows Point in Baltimore. This factory is huge. You call it Maryland Logistics Center. And it's going to grow our business, but in an efficient way. This factory is half a mile long, quarter of a mile wide. You don't tow it walking. You use a golf cart. That's what you're going to, that's a primer for what Anne and the team are going to see. The point I'm making is all these things we're doing because we believe we got to take a holistic approach. And the 3 pillars reinforce each other. The early warning, having farmers have technology they can get ordinarily. We partner with a company called Farm Force to give our farmers tablets. So when they're in the farming, in the farming locations, they don't get Wi-Fi. They don't get satellite or anything like that, or even the transmission station. But they can enter those things in the tablet. When they come back to the village where you have cell towers, it transmits to us. So there are ways to do things, but all these things have to be intertwined so we know what they are doing to the land, how they are, treating, where they are following the processes. It's really important to think about things holistically. So, and that's the only thing I can add to what you say. I'm looking forward to COP to share some of these things about how we're approaching it.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to all of you for this conversation in the run-up to COP. I think it's a very timely conversation, and we've only just scratched the surface in some ways of the prepared call to action and the engagement of the private sector. It obviously relates to the agri-food business. It relates to infrastructure. Christina and Anne, should we be looking to COP to see announcements about sort of more companies coming on board? Is that what we should? I'm seeing some nodding heads. I think that we should be having a lot more conversations on that front. We're at time, and I just want to make sure that I extend my deepest thanks to Swati, to Christina, to Anne, and to Michael for this conversation. It will exist on video, and others can watch it, and we can continue the conversation in other ways. Thank you so much for the work that you do to advance this presidential initiative and for joining us today.